Well, thank you so much for tuning into Morning Live. The International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, has projected South Africa's economic growth will remain sluggish in 2020. Now, concluding its visit to the country on Monday, the IMF warned that it's imperative for South Africa, it is rather imperative for South Africa to implement structural reforms to turn the country's economy around. And saying, and I quote, with low growth and low job creation, the increasing labor force is projected to exacerbate unemployment pressures, poverty and inequality, unquote. The IMF has also advised South Africa to create a favourable environment for private sector investment. And earlier this month, Moody's ratings agency downgraded South Africa from stable to negative, warning that drastic changes need to be implemented. So to discuss these developments further, we're joined by Ndumiso Hadebe, an economist and director at PAX Africana Investment Holdings, and Louw, executive director and co-founder of the Free Market Foundation. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thanks so much for having us.
Good to be with you and the viewers.
Let me start with a very generic question. Assess the state of our economy right now. Leon, you go first.
Well, it's got problems, obviously very severe problems, but you know, we tend not to pause and think about what's been achieved and what the good is. There's a lot good. It's not simple, it's not binary, it's not all bad or all good. It's a complex mixture, and the problems we face are mainly regulatory. It's that the government has just far too much red tape. As every State of the Nation address since President Mbeki has said, promised to remove and relax red tape so that there can be growth, not of big business, but of small business, small independent people who can access finance, can get easily into business, don't have to pay bribes, don't get harassed. But it's never happened. While they're giving that address, every minister does the same thing. Their own department is busy increasing regulation. If you take the Minister of Finance, who's come up with some good ideas, good policies, while he announces them, his own department is increasing and tightening up on the regulatory environment governing finance and making it essentially impossible under the Market Conduct Authority for new independent, largely black businesses to enter the market as financial service providers or as financial providers. So as everyone who deals like the Mbeki Foundation with rural women trying to get them finance, it can't be done lawfully under these crazy laws. So the long and short of it is they keep saying they are going to open up the economy and make it more investor friendly. They keep saying they're going to make it small business friendly, and they keep doing the opposite. And that is what the IMF is trying to say. For heaven's sake, stop throttling the economy. And I want to close this part by saying, to understand what's going on in South Africa, imagine a woman sitting with a baby on her knee, a mother. With one hand, she's throttling the baby, and with the other hand, she's trying to feed the baby. Make up your mind. Do you want to throttle the economy or do you want to feed the economy? If you want to feed it, get out of the way, remove restrictions, free it up, get rid of exchange controls, get rid of licensing laws, red tape, lower the tax rates so that employers have more money with which to employ and they are attracted to South Africa instead of driven away. There are 200 countries in the world who want them. If we want to get them, we have to come up with something quite special, quite spectacular, quite attractive.
Ndumiso?
I think the challenges that we face are well documented in South Africa, and primarily on the demand side, we have weak demand in South Africa as a result of a subdued economy. But I think there are a number of things that are within our control that we can do to change the situation that we're currently in, more so on the supply side. And I think if we are to look at more of the medium to long term in terms of changing South Africa's trajectory, we'd first, for instance, have to look at the education outcomes in South Africa, for instance, where every year you find a pupil who starts grade 1.1 million across the country. By the time they're in matric, only about 670,000 are left. The others are left out of the education system and they fall under the NEET category, not in employment, educational training, and then they're loitering around, and then it translates into the additional number of people who are available to work but don't have job opportunities to be able to work in. Then you have an instance where the structure of the South African economy is such that the biggest contributor to our nominal GDP is business and financial services. Those kinds of sectors require a certain level of skill set. Now, if we were to refer to these young people who fall under that NEET category, and we have instances where there are about over 700,000 jobs that are available at any given point in time in the South African economy, then it speaks about this mismatch that we consistently talk about in South African economy. If we are to address the medium and to long-term prosperity of the South African economy, we first need to look at that point. And all of these other things, such as infrastructure rollout and the quality of spend, because again, in my view, I don't necessarily think that in South Africa, even in a subdued economic environment, we have a money problem per se. I think we have a quality of expenditure in South Africa. So if we are allocating 5 rands towards the building of clinics and new schools and roads, how much of that is indeed deployed towards those specific projects? And whenever there are cost and time overruns, what informs those time and cost overruns? Is it efficiencies from the side of the state? Is it efficiencies from the side of service providers to the state? What are those challenges? And dealing with those challenges then would result in an instance where we do get a bank for our money in that respect.
And just on that point, it speaks to what has been referred to very widely as systemic corruption across the board, really. And when you talk about cost overruns, you look at Medupi, you look at Kusile, and those are just the big ones that everybody talks about, that's top of mind. Those sort of projects happen every day in various municipalities where there are cost overruns that nobody is held accountable for. But speaking of these SOEs, listening to what Moody's have said, listening to what the IMF have said, they're essentially saying the same thing. Something drastic needs to happen. So what is that drastic something? Leon?
Well, firstly, it's easy to see the big dark cloud, and we do have a big dark cloud in South Africa, but I do want to point out that there's a silver lining. So take corruption. Of course it's a problem, but I'm very proud to live in a country in which it's freely spoken about, in which it's investigated, in which people can be openly, publicly accused, and where corruption is not covered up. So there is a silver lining even to corruption. There are many countries in which we would not have the vigorous discourse and exposure of corrupt people that we have here. What we have to do with the SOEs is indeed drastic. Some of them cannot be rescued. South African Airways, for example, has no assets. You can't give it away for free, even if you pay off all the debts. No one would want it. It's just a bundle of liabilities. So what you need to do with that...
You're sure about that? Absolutely sure.
Oh, yes. No, I mean, they haven't produced financial statements for 2 years, but
this is true.
If we look at their previous statements and we drew extrapolations from them, we must assume it has no more airplanes. It's now all leases. In other words, liabilities. It has liabilities to pay lease agreements rather than planes it could sell, for example. It does have assets, but they're very small. It has the brand, firstly, SAA. It has landing slots. It has bilateral agreements to fly in and out of countries. Now, you could easily do a deal with one of the successful major international airlines in the world and say, come and fly the South African brand. Passengers won't know the difference. You'll get onto what looks like a South African Airways plane, but it would in fact be operated by someone else. The way right now you get onto a British Airways plane, which is in fact Comair. So you think you're on British Airways, but actually you're on Comair. That's what we could do with something like South African Airways. Other state-owned enterprises, similar problems. You mentioned, for example, Medupi and Kusile and the cost overruns. They are spectacular. They dwarf everything else in South Africa in a degree. It's like, if that's the only issue we deal with, just the cost overrun on one power station is enough to provide something like 500,000 RDP houses.
But then the question arises, so if we know this, if this evidence is out there in the public domain, everybody knows it, why isn't anything being done, Ndumiso?
I think ultimately it becomes a leadership question and an effective governance question in terms of what officials who are designated with the roles that they're supposed to be doing to actively address time and cost overruns in those instances. And I think more prominently with respect to the recent reports by the Auditor General with respect to local municipalities, where they cited that only out of the audited municipalities, 19% of them actually produced quality financial statements without any misstatements, as it were. So you have this other balance that's not doing that. In certain instances, documents or reports that are being submitted are not even financial statements to begin with. So it then raises the question to say, for instance, a municipal manager or an official who is in charge of ensuring effective control and governance in a local municipality, for example, what is it that they're not doing, and are they being held accountable for the role that they're playing? And again, at a local government level, you have the role of council, you have the administrative functions as well. What is being done there to hold each other accountable? And I think it fundamentally becomes a leadership question.
But isn't that part of the problem? We skirt around these issues. The answer to that is very simple. People are not being held accountable. People are getting paid salaries for jobs that they are not doing. So, you know, getting back to the point you raised about the Auditor General, Leon, the Auditor General's report states that none of the SOEs that were audited in this last round of audits received a clean audit. So what are we doing?
Well, I want to give a sort of defense of the people involved who work for them. Let's get this clear. The people employed by these SOEs are very decent, productive people, like your colleagues right here at the SABC. People who are professional, who want to do their work. The trouble is that there's this endless interference politically by ministers who hire and fire chief executives, financial directors. Nobody knows if they're going to have a job next month or even tomorrow. Boards are hired and fired constantly, and we don't regard simple governance principles. We recently had a judgment against Minister Hadebe for irregularly hiring and firing staff at Nexa, which was, by the way, the only profitable state-owned enterprise with a clean audit. And so if you are the CEO of any state-owned enterprise now or in the chair, what do? You think to yourself, I've got a short shelf life. I could get a call tomorrow from a minister, not a board, not under the company law, but from some political motivation, and given marching orders, as happened to people in Eskom recently, as happened to people in SABC, as happened to people in SAA. So I would say what you first want to do is get professional, qualified people into these positions, and many of them are professional and qualified, and let them do their job. Liberate them from political interference. Let them get on with what they can do. Here at the SABC, for example, my view is you have incredible people. You know, you work here more than me. Now, these people are being frustrated by political interference, by insecurity, by no permanence, by no predictability.
But what's the solution to that? Because you're quite correct in pointing out that that is a huge part of the problem. But what is the solution to that? Because we talk about ethical leadership. We I'm not even going to go into the realm of morality. Just on an ethical basis, why aren't people doing what they're supposed to do? If you are asked by a superior to do something that is unlawful, surely you have the right to push back. Why aren't people doing it? Are we perhaps giving them a free pass, all these executives?
Well, part of it, I think it's also around the mechanics of managing consequences, around being able to effectively hold people accountable on the one side. And that requires, again, people to do that. But I think the reason why I mentioned that it becomes fundamentally a leadership question is that there needs to be something that binds people together as to what are we here for. And I think in previous times, particularly in the time of Madiba, he used to refer to, when they rolled out the RDP program, not only the RDP, but he mentioned the RDP of the soul. And when a leader articulates such messaging, that yes, it's a reconstruction and development program, but it's more about roads, infrastructure, clinics. It's about dignity and ethics and ensuring that we create an equitable society. And I would think at a qualitative level, that kind of messaging has been missing. And I think as human beings, as a function of as how we function in societies and our roles, that plays an integral part in terms of driving our actions towards a particular goal, particularly if you are a public servant and you know that what you're doing is far and over beyond yourself in that respect.
Can we get back there? Is it even possible? The World Bank estimates South Africa is the most unequal country. How do we get back to that reconstruction and development, not only of our country and of the infrastructure, but of our own souls that will drive that sort of redress?
Let me say it is actually not difficult. It's not rocket science. It's easy. What you do is very simple. You don't appoint a new board of advisors to the president. What you do is you look around the world at the countries that have achieved that have had a quick, fantastic turnaround. China, India, Mauritius, Rwanda, Switzerland, Hong Kong. They're countries that were stagnant or backward or declining, corrupt for years and years and years, for 100 years. You know, India, for example, has been stagnant. And then all of a sudden in 1979 or whatever, I forget the date, it suddenly starts booming and becomes one of the highest growth countries in the world. Corruption stops declining, people start being efficient, people start working. China, of course, is the great example, unbelievable. What you do is you simply say, what do the winners do? What are the ones who get that right? What are the ones who get that turnaround you're asking for? How did they achieve it? We mustn't reinvent the wheel. Do what they did. You say to yourself, in the year China became one of the world's most spectacular success stories, what changed? What were the changes that took place immediately before that? Let's do the same changes here.
Is it
and
possible,
the countries that go the other way, like Argentina or Venezuela, you say, what changed in a successful country that was followed by catastrophe? So let's not do that, and let's do what the winners do and stop doing what the losers do.
But can we do that, as Leon points out, and Ndumiso, given our proud record of, you know, human rights and how we protect people's rights in this country? Some would juxtapose that to a China and say chalk and cheese. So how do we get there? What is the low-hanging fruit?
I think we certainly can, and I think we come from a much better base as opposed to other countries as well across the globe, because it was a similar challenge we faced in 1994 in terms of state formation. The Madiba administration faced a critical challenge around a lack of skills, because there was a perception globally around, oh, South Africa might be another failed African state. So a lot of people were leaving the country, skills were leaving the country, the state was not as well capacitated for the kind of state organs that were being built. And there was deliberate attempts to build state capacity in that respect. After Madiba, then we had a transition or a period where it was about economic transformation or building the macroeconomic fundamentals, so dealing with exchange rates, dealing with twin deficit, current account, budget deficits, and so on. We got that relatively in order. Hence today, with last week's CPI numbers being reined in at 3.7% within the South African Reserve Bank target band. So we did all of those things at a macro level. Now, we've also faced a period where we faced a period of lack of good governance. And of course, I think in any new state formation process, one would find that kind of fight back or deficiencies. But I think because of the base from which we come from, it makes it much easier. Because yes, we do have those institutions to reaffirm those macroeconomic fundamentals, but also at a macro level, but also at a leadership level as well. But secondly, the level of political stability or instability that we have is something that is open and is transparent, and it's something that can be done with, again, the right kind of leadership. We come from a much better base off to be able to address all of those challenges. And I think with that being taken into account, then we'd be able to effect the right kind of changes.
Well, of course, that's unfortunately where we have to leave it. Thank you so much to our guest this morning, Ndumiso Hadebe, who is an economist and director at Pax Africana Investment, and also Louw, who is executive director and co-founder of the Free Market Foundation. It's time for the news at 7 with Leanne.